Far Middle Podcast, episode 25, or AKA Los Angeles Redux Part 2. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. Nick DeOlius with you. And for episode 25, who are we going to go with our sort of sports athlete, sports great? Well, I thought it over. I'm going to go with Fred Biletnikoff, the great receiver for the Oakland Raiders back in the 70s. Fred Biletnikoff, originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, so not far from where I call home in Western PA. Super Bowl MVP, Hall of Famer, great hands, ran great routes. Not the quickest receiver that you'd see in NFL history, but one that really excelled just because of his focus on running routes and his hands and his ability to make great catches, and really did all of that in an era of the NFL when it was very run-focused and run-centric. So what he achieved and what he accomplished as a receiver, I think, is doubly impressive when you consider the era that he did it in. So it's neat to think through what he would be able to achieve, what his stats would look like if he played in sort of an era that was more passing focused like today's NFL. Went to college at Florida State, which was always interesting to me, how an Erie, Pennsylvania boy would end up going to college at Florida State and then end up playing for the Raiders. He's also, by the way, not just in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. When I said Hall of Famer, he's also in the College Hall of Fame. Because of what he was able to do down at Florida State. And of course, he's got an award named after him. So when you get awards named after you, the Biletnikoff Award for the nation's best collegiate receiver each year, that's usually saying something, a good indication that somebody's worthy of dedicating a podcast number to. Now, if you really want to see a different era in football, and what I think is the greatest era of professional football for the NFL, go on YouTube, check out some of these games, and I'd sort of refer you probably to the playoff games where the most was on the line. But check out a game like the 1975 AFC Championship game between the Raiders and the Steelers. Oakland Raiders visiting the Pittsburgh Steelers early January of 76, right? So this is for the 75 AFC Championship. You got Madden against Chuck Noll, two Hall of Fame coaches, Three Rivers Stadium. I think the temperature was 18 degrees. There's ice on the field. I mean, officially or technically, the game was played on AstroTurf, but in reality, it was played on concrete, especially when it's 18 degrees out. And you just see a brand of football that you don't see today. I mean, it is a brutal, physical brand of football. But you've probably got, it doesn't matter who has the ball. So whether it's Steelers offense and Raiders defense or Raiders offense, Steelers defense, you have upwards of 10 Hall of Famers on the field at any given point in time. It's just amazing how those two teams were stacked with awesome players, including Fred Biletnikoff. But you're seeing hits that you don't see today. You'd be not just suspended for a game, you might be suspended for the season when you look at some of those hits. Late hits, high hits to the head, ripping helmets off. Cliff Branch and Lynn Swann were basically assaulted throughout that game. But give it a look, and you can almost hear John Facenda in NFL Films coming through the highlights when you're watching the game cast on something like YouTube. It's pretty cool to go back to that era and check it out. And the other interesting thing about picking our namesake for episode 25, I noticed when I was thinking it through that I was coming up with a lot of more modern-day baseball players, power hitters, and sort of, clouded reputationally with the steroid issue in the steroid era. Because there's a lot of number 25s that sort of fit that description. You got Barry Bonds, of course. Rafael Palmeiro was wearing 25 for a while, Sammy Sosa, and Mark McGwire. So it's interesting how all the power hitters of the 90s and 2000s and ones that sometimes ran up against the steroid controversy was sort of associated with number 25, but I chose obviously to go in a different direction with Biletnikoff. Now, as I said, this is part 2 of our Los Angeles observations, and I think they're really timely, important observations affecting cities beyond Los Angeles and areas of the country far beyond California. And I hope that this part 2 episode of the Far Middle, when it comes to LA observations, is in line with that great sequel of The Godfather Part 2 and doesn't fall into the trash bin of some other sequels that never sort of lived up to the hype of their predecessor films. So let's strive for a Godfather Part 2 instead of some of the other sort of losers that fell into the sequel category. Now, we're going to pick up where we left off with the last podcast, because one of the themes across those different connections that we made in the last podcast was government. And this could be federal government, state government within California, LA City Council we talked about, the expert class within government, but basically the bureaucracy, the administrative state, taking situations that we talked about on the last episode, like homelessness, like the infrastructure supply chain issues, and effectively making them worse. Not addressing them or solving them, but making them worse. That theme is also going to pop up from time to time on this episode of the Far Middle. And I'm going to start with the services industry and specifically with restaurants. I've always been interested in restaurants. I've been one of those individuals that always had sort of the fantasy of opening one up or running one, but then I'm usually smart enough to stop myself with pursuing that because I recognize all the hard work and expertise that is required to do that and how I'd be an abject failure at it right out of the chute. So I've always been interested in it, and I like to talk to people that are involved in that sector of the economy, and I was able to do that with this recent trip. And I had a chance to talk to someone that is the owner of a very successful restaurant in the Los Angeles area, a relatively new one. It's been around for maybe 4 years, but it has just taken off, and it's been wildly successful, and they're looking at opening up additional locations, not just in Southern California, but across the country. So whether it was that restaurant or any of the other ones that I had visited, could have been lunch, could have been dinner, didn't matter. The first observation that hit me was how empty a lot of these establishments were, which was surprising to me because A, it was different than what I saw at different cities that I had visited recently. I mentioned my Washington, D.C. trip on a prior episode of the Far Middle, where the restaurants there were basically full and at capacity, but also surprising because you consider what's happened to the supply of restaurants in terms of capacity, right? You've had restaurants that have completely gone away and shut down because of COVID, went out of business. You've had restaurants that have scaled back significantly their hours of operation, whether it's days of operation or hours of operation because of staff shortages and everything else. So the supply of available tables, so to speak, has been diminished. You'd think that the restaurants that are available and the tables that are open would be as packed as ever, but that was not the case. In talking to this owner of the restaurant, he basically had a really interesting way of summing it up. He said, and I was able to sort of get him down to a quote. He said, "It's always been excruciatingly expensive to run a business here, but you could shoulder it if you offered top product. Now, though, we're told to shut down, and then when we reopen, the government makes it even more expensive to get people to come work and makes it more painful for customers to eat out. It's been a death knell for lots of great establishments," end quote. So that was a great summation, I think, from an owner on sort of the front lines of what's going on with the services sector and the services industry as to some of the challenges that are out there. And again, the observation, this time particular to the restaurant service industry, of how government and regulation and the administrative state oftentimes is making things much worse on the value creator instead of helping them create value to the benefit of a bunch of stakeholders across the economy and across society. So while government and heavy-handed regulation is squeezing the supply chain, and it is hitting areas like the service economy hard and value creators hard, and it is making problems and issues like homelessness even worse, who was the one stakeholder that is benefiting from all this increased regulation and oversight and bureaucracy? Well, I know this might be shocking to you, but it is government itself. Government has been, without a doubt, the biggest beneficiary of all this increased regulation, oversight, and heavy-handedness. Just to give you an example, California's prime. I was in town that week. Governor Newsom was out there bragging at the time that the state was going to have another, and the term he used was historic budget surplus next year. So he was sort of forecasting the budget for next fiscal year, and it was looking to be a historic surplus. This was coming off, interestingly, a massive surplus this year. So you're going to have 2 years back-to-back in California where the state, the government, is going to have and enjoy a massive surplus. Now, what's the reason for these twin pairing of surpluses and what's driving them? What's the root causes? There's a couple of obvious sort of contributors. One is the massive subsidy that's coming from the federal government to California under the banner of COVID relief. Now, what does that mean? In reality, what that means, it's a form of wealth redistribution from flyover country, and that can be middle America or that can be inland California for that matter, to areas like coastal California and the Northeast corridor in the coastal areas of the Northeast United States. Another big contributor to these twin budget surpluses is the government, through COVID and under the banner of pandemic. What did they do? They dropped a lot of services. They stopped providing services across the board. And when you do that, the expenditures that government outlays to provide those services has dropped. So its own mandated shutdowns basically drove a reduction in expenditures in government, but that also came with the elimination or the stopping of providing government services. So what's that translation? How do I view that? Well, basically that is government that is stopping its job. It stops doing its job basically to save money and helps create a budget surplus. And then another big driver, contributor, was that you had the taxes that were coming into the state coffers at very high levels. So value creators in the free market that get no COVID relief, they're going to have to continue to pay up. So they have less government services that are available to them. They're going to be subjected to a whole bunch of new regulation and oversight from government. But when they're out there scrapping every day to create value for themselves, they still have to continue to pay up at the same rate that they did to government. So the pandemic overall has been really good, very beneficial to California government. That was an obvious observation that was out there for everyone to see during my visit. And while government has been the biggest beneficiary of its own mandates and its own regulations via pandemic and shutdowns, it's also warranting on energy matters that there's zero carbon, going to a zero carbon world. But I'm here to tell you my observation was one that is crystal clear that Los Angeles basin, that greater Los Angeles area, is not going to be anything close to carbon neutral in our lifetimes. Everywhere you looked, you saw carbon being utilized and embraced in a big way. You saw heavy vehicle traffic on every interstate and road that I came across. And by the way, those are still predominantly combustion engine vehicles on the 405 freeway, not electric vehicles, although you do see a lot of electric vehicles, which, by the way, is usually largely powered by carbon as well because of the nature of the grid, the power grid. At night, the metropolis is just a sea of lights everywhere. Climate, at least indoor climate, is still controlled, so air conditioning is something that's enjoyed by everyone there, largely carbon powered. Everywhere you look, of course, what are people doing? They're looking down on those charged smartphones and the manufacturing of smartphones and the charging of them to keep them powered, right? That's a largely carbon intensive endeavor. And the consumption of carbon products, or at least carbon provided products, it's everywhere. I mean, the food chain alone, I talked about restaurants on the prior observation. The food chain, supply chain, when it comes to not just Los Angeles, but anywhere else in this country, relies heavily on carbon. In fact, many areas in Western Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh area is a good example of this. A study at Carnegie Mellon has shown that the carbon intensity of the food supply chain in the Pittsburgh area is actually higher than the carbon intensity of the electricity that is utilized within the Pittsburgh region. And people they hear that and they're shocked, but it's not surprising when you think about all the things that go into growing food, processing it, delivering it, and then ultimately consuming it. It requires an awful lot of carbon. And then, everything else, medical devices and all the other products that are being utilized, plastics-based products that are basically carbon derived in some way, shape, or form. And all this really means that as quality of life continues to crawl along and grow, the power grid demand, it's growing too. And wind and solar are not going to come close to filling that power demand in any sort of reliable way or sense. So California, despite what its government is desiring and warranting, it is still a carbon-driven economy, and that was very evident across the couple of days around Los Angeles. But, this leads to the next observation. Despite everything running on carbon in California for the foreseeable future, government, whether it's state government in California or the local governments there, federal government, you can throw them in now at this point, they keep doing all they can to make carbon prohibitively more expensive, particularly for the middle class and for the working poor that rely on carbon the most to be able to go out and do what they do and create value. Gasoline prices, when I was out there, were averaging more than $4.50 a gallon. That is a significant level to pay for gasoline. And the wealthy elite, don't worry about them. They're driving around subsidized electric vehicles or all kinds of expensive late model foreign vehicles, or a combination of the two, expensive foreign late model vehicles that are electric. And they don't care. They could care less, could not care less about the price of something as incidental to them as gasoline. But when you look at that whole army of service providers that are there creating value and earning a living, and a lot of those services being provided to the wealthy elite, those small business owners also alongside the service providers, they're scrapping and fighting and toiling every day to eke out an income and a margin and a living. And they're doing that increasingly under a mountain of regulation and taxes and bureaucracy. And you know what? That fuel cost, things like the cost of gasoline, that could be the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to what's going to happen to the middle class and the working poor and the small business owners. Ironically, many of which in areas like Los Angeles are doing things, providing services to basically cater to the elite class that are oftentimes supporting or instituting these onerous regulations and costs upon society. And that observation on the price of gasoline in California and the impacts that it has really leads to a much broader observation, and one that goes and has ramifications far beyond California. And that is this issue of what's going on when it comes to things like natural gas in our economy versus things like wind and solar. You know, there was a whole cadre of elites in government, academia. Probably the most famous one in that group was the Yale professor Bill Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for this issue, which was really a simple concept or theory that he put forth. You know, his view was that, look, natural gas beats hands down things like wind and solar when it comes to cost per kilowatt hour, when it comes to reliability, affordability, when it comes to the ability to scale this in our power generation grid. And if you want to move away from something like natural gas, you can't rely on the free market to do it, because natural gas is going to clean the clock of wind and solar. So what you need to do is you need to find a way to raise the price of natural gas relative to wind and solar. And that's when you come up with things that are driving toward either subsidizing wind and solar to give it a competitive advantage, or raising the cost of things like natural gas, all under the cover of saving the Earth's climate, you know, to stop us from looking at Armageddon in the face and reducing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So it was people like Professor Nordhaus and others that basically came up with a concept of doing things to increase the costs of not just natural gas and oil, right, but also, since energy is the feedstock of every imaginable economic activity you can think of, raising the cost of everything else, of food, of transportation, of housing, of every imaginable product or service that you can think of. And that is a big driver, perhaps the primary root cause of what is driving all this runaway inflation that we're seeing in this country and across the globe. And you can call it transitory all you want, Federal Reserve and Chairman Powell, but we know inflation when we see it. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, at some point it is a duck. This is inflation. It's here to stay, and it's inflation that's been self-induced by really two primary things. One, this issue of looking to raise the cost of affordable energy via things like natural gas, taxes, regulations, et cetera, and subsidy to wind and solar. And then B, the free money policies of the Federal Reserve, where that printing press of money is just spinning at a rate you can't even see it. It's spinning so quickly. And that, of course, is also stoking the fires of inflation. So this issue of how academia and economists and government are trying to game the system, change the wiring of the system to affect the price of affordable energy through things like natural gas, which then stokes inflation across the board for everyone and everything. That then leads to the next observation that I have to offer with respect to Los Angeles. Inflation creates economic hardship. When you have economic hardship, desperate people begin to do desperate things, and one of the sort of symptoms of economic hardship is going to be an uptick in crime. And crime, both property crime and violent crime, it remains a problem in Los Angeles like most of our major American cities today. The morning that I departed and left Los Angeles, I brought news on the headlines of an overnight shooting there that had claimed multiple victims. So unfortunately, it was newsworthy, but it was not newsworthy as in something unique. It was something that the city had been dealing with for a number of years now. And homicides in Los Angeles, they're spiking. In 2020, they totaled nearly 350. They're on pace, I think, this year to surpass last year's number. So it's not been a good trend. It's been a tragic trend for sure. But you see what people are doing, sort of everyday people across Los Angeles when it comes to crime. I don't know if they have their heads on a swivel or not. It's hard to say with respect to that. But walking around residential areas in the city, what do you see? You see security cameras everywhere. And security cameras, they cover every imaginable angle of home exteriors across every neighborhood street you want to walk down. It doesn't matter if it's a middle-class neighborhood, a rich neighborhood, you see them everywhere. But yet, when I look at those and I see them, I wonder in the end if all the surveillance video and all those feeds, those video feeds and security signs that you see in the yards, right, all those warning signs and notification signs, I don't know if they have any deterrent effect on property crime in the end. The statistics are indicating that they do not, but nevertheless, you see sort of people responding to what's happening with crime, property, and violence, which is the infrastructure of security technology everywhere you look these days. Now, that observation on crime and quality of life sort of sends me and connects to the next thought that I want to put out there, which is another driver of quality of life, and that is the issue of marijuana. Marijuana isn't just legal in California. Marijuana is everywhere in California. And you don't see it as much as you smell it constantly. I mean, I smelled it walking outside on neighborhood streets, and it didn't matter if it was a middle-class neighborhood or an exclusive, wealthy neighborhood, you smelled it everywhere. Driving in traffic, I can't tell you how many traffic lights were stopped at where that odor of marijuana makes its way into the car. And obviously just walking around just shopping areas or shopping districts, you've got it there too. And that smell is present during all times of the day. It's not just in the evening. You smell it morning, noon, and night. So on the issue of marijuana, I've talked to a lot of people, some of them very passionate about this, that make the case and cite and tout the medical studies that show that moderate marijuana use is much less harmful to human health than things like tobacco, smoke, and things like heavy alcohol, or even in some studies, moderate alcohol consumption. So I sort of get it, and I tend to agree with it. I think that tobacco, smoke, and certainly heavy alcohol use are much more harmful than moderate marijuana use. I get that. I agree with that. But I also got to tell you, I've just got a concern with this. And the concern is one of where many of us end up, utilizing marijuana on a regular basis. What's that cumulative effect on society and on our economy? If a lot of us are going to be continually numbed down and drained from regular marijuana use, is the answer going to be more of us just sort of sitting at home, mindlessly, streaming through whatever series on Netflix we're streaming through, or sitting on the couch doing much of nothing? Does that mean less achievement? And is that consistent with the American way? I don't think that's consistent with the American way, at least the American way that got us to where we're at today. So I fear that this issue of marijuana, and a lot of us now sort of partaking in marijuana use on a moderate or regular basis, I think that's going to have a cumulative impact at some point on just, I don't know if it's work ethic or drive or the American way, call it what you want. But I do get concerned, and I think this recent trip to Los Angeles just sort of heightened that concern that that's going to have an impact at some point down the road. So as we wrap this episode in part 2 of our Los Angeles observations with the far middle, I just want to tell you, flying home on that airplane, carbon-fueled airplane, by the way, still carbon-fueled, I had time to think about those couple of days. And to me, Southern California is such an interesting place because it reflects this dichotomy that we're seeing in modern day America. On one hand, you've got that proud legacy, you got the embarrassment of riches that represents Southern California. And then on the other side, you've got it colliding with this cresting wave of a wall of worry, of mounting problems that are getting worse and worse. And you worry that that's going to result in a tomorrow that frankly is unsustainable. And it really brings to mind the thoughts of the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. I don't know if you're familiar with Isaiah Berlin or not, but he was really, I think, poignant for laying out and contrasting two really important, crucial types of freedom. And he called them negative liberty and positive liberty. So negative liberty is basically having the freedom from any types of interference by others. And others, of course, can include government. So negative liberty is being left alone, effectively, to go create value, to go achieve, to go accomplish. Positive liberty, that's the freedom to control your own destiny and to decide for yourself what you're going to do, what you're going to make of your life. Now, both of these are important, right? If you want to live in an ideal environment and operate under an ideal set of circumstances, you want to enjoy both negative liberty and positive liberty. And the California of today and the Los Angeles of today, to me, feels like it's going through a transition, which I think is representative of much of what's going on in the country at large, where we're evolving from a history and a legacy where individuals enjoyed significant amounts of negative liberty. They were left alone to go achieve, to go toil, to go accomplish things, along with enjoying a significant level of positive liberty. You make your own way, you make your own decisions, the individual reigns supreme. And today, increasingly, what we're faced with is a set of circumstances and regulations and laws and government across all levels where the elites are taking away our negative liberty. They're interfering more and more with our day-to-day decision-making and what's good for the individual. And we're also seeing an erosion of our positive liberty, where you're not free to make your own decisions and control your own destiny, at least to the extent that you used to be able to. And I think California is one of those canaries in the coal mine where you will see the sort of leading indicators of what the culmination of that loss of negative and positive liberties will manifest in. I hope I'm wrong on that, but based on what I've seen over those couple of days, I suspect that I might be onto something. Hope you enjoyed this episode, number 25 of the Far Middle Podcast. I will be posting on Twitter regularly, so check me out at Nick Deolius, and also check into the website nickdeolius.com for new thoughts and commentary that's posted on there regularly. Talk to you next week. Until then, take care.